The walls would go up section by section, and finally he would tackle the complex geometry of the roof. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel found himself falling into the meditative rhythm of purposeful work. Each board he examined, each measurement he took, each small repair he completed brought him closer to his goal. The forest animals settled into acceptance of his presence, and the red squirrel even ventured down from his tree to investigate the toolbox. By evening, Samuel had accomplished more than he had thought possible. The cabin's footprint was completely cleared. The foundation stones were cleaned and assessed, and he had sorted the salvageable materials into organized piles. Most importantly, he had a plan and the tools to execute it. As darkness fell, Samuel built a small fire in what remained of the old fireplace. The chimney drew well, sending smoke up through the broken stonework toward the stars. He cooked a simple meal of wild greens and the last of his stored food, then spent the evening by firelight, examining each tool in his grandfather's collection and planning the work ahead. Tomorrow the real construction would begin. The sound that woke Samuel on his 6th morning in the wilderness was unfamiliar, a rhythmic clanking that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the eastern ridge. He lay still in his pine bough bed, listening carefully as his grandfather had taught him to do when encountering anything new in the forest. The sound came again, metal striking metal in a pattern too regular to be natural. After a breakfast of pine needle tea and wild berries, Samuel followed the sound up a steep game trail that wound between massive granite boulders. The climb was treacherous, but his weeks of wilderness living had strengthened his legs and sharpened his balance. At the ridge's crest, he discovered something that made his heart race with possibility. Below him, cutting through a narrow valley, lay the rusted remains of an old railroad track. The rails themselves had been removed long ago, probably during one of the wars when metal was scarce, but the railroad ties remained. Hundreds of them stretching into the distance like a wooden pathway through the forest, and scattered along the abandoned roadbed were pieces of metal hardware that had once held the rails in place. Iron spikes, steel plates, and heavy bolts that rang like bells when the wind moved them. Samuel scrambled down into the valley, his mind already racing with possibilities. Railroad ties were made from the finest timber, treated with creosote to resist rot and insects. They would make perfect foundation beams for his cabin reconstruction. The metal hardware could be fashioned into hinges, brackets, and reinforcements that would make his building stronger than anything James Morrison could have achieved with hand tools alone. But retrieving the materials would require more than enthusiasm. A single railroad tie weighed over 200 pounds, far too heavy for a 12-year-old boy to move alone. Samuel would need to think like an engineer, using leverage and ingenuity to accomplish what brute strength could not. He spent the morning studying the problem, walking the length of the abandoned track and cataloging what was available. Near what had once been a water stop, he found the remains of a loading platform and the rusted framework of a hand-powered rail cart. Most of the cart had been stripped away, but the iron wheels and axle assembly remained intact. Samuel returned to his cabin site and retrieved his grandfather's tools along with some rope he had salvaged from the debris. The next 3 days were spent in careful engineering, building a makeshift sled that could transport the heavy railroad ties down the mountain. Using principles his grandfather had taught him about mechanical advantage, Samuel constructed a system of pulleys and levers that allowed him to move objects many times his own weight. The work was exhausting and often dangerous. One tie slipped from his improvised sled and nearly crushed his leg. Another time the rope snapped under load and sent him tumbling backward into a thicket of brambles. But with each successful transport, Samuel's confidence grew. He was learning skills that went beyond anything his grandfather had taught him, solving problems through trial and error and careful observation. As he worked, Samuel found himself developing relationships with the forest animals that had initially viewed him with suspicion. The red squirrel, whom he had begun calling Chester, often rode along on the railroad tie sled, chattering encouragement during the difficult passages. A family of raccoons discovered that his work sometimes exposed grubs and insects, and they began following his activities like a cleanup crew. Most surprising was the young black bear that appeared on his 10th day of hauling materials. Samuel's first instinct was fear, but the bear showed no aggression. Instead, it seemed curious about the strange human activities in its territory. Samuel remembered his grandfather's advice about wildlife. Respect them, give them space, but don't assume they mean harm unless they show it. The bear, whom Samuel began thinking of as Bruno, became a regular observer of the construction work. It seemed particularly fascinated by the mechanical aspects of Samuel's engineering solutions, sometimes sitting for hours watching the pulley systems in operation. Samuel found the creature's presence oddly comforting, as if even the forest's most powerful residents approved of his project. By the end of 2 weeks, Samuel had transported enough railroad ties to reconstruct the cabin's entire foundation system. More importantly, he had learned advanced problem-solving skills that would serve him throughout the construction process. He had discovered that every challenge had a solution if he was willing to think creatively and work patiently. On the evening of his 14th day, Samuel sat beside his fire, examining a massive iron railroad spike he had retrieved that afternoon. The spike was over 6 inches long and forged from high-quality steel. In his grandfather's hands, such a piece of metal could become a dozen different tools: punches, chisels, wedges, or pry bars. Samuel held the spike up to the firelight, feeling its weight and balance. Tomorrow he would begin the delicate work of forging his own tools from the railroad hardware. The cabin reconstruction was becoming more than just a building project. It was becoming an education in self-reliance that would serve him for the rest of his life. Chester the squirrel chittered from his perch in the nearby pine, and somewhere in the darkness, Bruno the bear shuffled through the underbrush. Samuel was no longer alone in the wilderness. He had built a community of unlikely companions, both human and animal, who shared his vision of creating something permanent and beautiful in this remote place. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning when the autumn air carried the first real bite of approaching winter. Samuel had been working on the cabin's north wall, fitting a particularly stubborn log into place, when the makeshift scaffold he had built from salvaged lumber gave way beneath him. He fell 8 feet, landing hard on a pile of railroad ties with his left arm twisted beneath his body. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Samuel lay motionless for several minutes, fighting waves of nausea and trying to assess the damage. His arm throbbed with a deep grinding ache that suggested something more serious than a simple bruise. When he finally managed to sit up, he could see that his wrist was swollen and already beginning to discolor. For the first time since beginning his mountain odyssey, Samuel felt the full weight of his isolation. There was no one to call for help, no hospital within 50 miles, no adult to make decisions about his care. He was 12 years old, alone in the wilderness, and possibly seriously injured. But panic would not serve him now. Samuel forced himself to breathe slowly and think through the situation as his grandfather would have done. The old man had been a medic in Vietnam and had taught Samuel basic first aid during their summers together. More importantly, he had taught him that clear thinking was the most valuable tool in any emergency. Samuel carefully examined his injured arm, moving his fingers and testing his range of motion. The pain was severe, but he could move everything. No bones were obviously broken, though he suspected he had sprained his wrist badly. Using strips torn from his flannel shirt, he fashioned a crude sling to immobilize the joint. The greater challenge would be continuing his work with only one functional hand. Winter was approaching rapidly, and Samuel could already see snow on the highest peaks. The cabin needed to be weatherproof within weeks, or he would not survive until spring. That evening, as Samuel sat by his fire, nursing his injury, he made a discovery that would change his relationship with the wilderness forever. While searching through the debris around the old cabin site, he had found a small glass medicine bottle with a handwritten label that read, "Willow bark extract for pain and fever." The bottle was empty, but it reminded Samuel of lessons his grandfather had taught him about natural remedies. Willow trees grew abundantly along the stream that ran past his clearing, and Samuel remembered that their inner bark contained compounds similar to modern aspirin. Working carefully with his one good hand, He harvested bark from young willow branches and prepared it the way his grandfather had shown him, scraping the inner bark into fine shavings, then steeping them in hot water to make a bitter but effective tea. The willow bark tea did indeed reduce his pain, but more importantly, the process of making it connected Samuel to generations of people who had lived and healed themselves from the land. James Morrison had probably used similar remedies during his time in the cabin. Indigenous peoples had certainly used these same plants for thousands of years before any European settlers arrived. Over the following days, as Samuel adapted his work methods to accommodate his injury, he found himself paying attention to the natural world in new ways. He noticed which plants the deer browsed on, which berries the birds preferred, which areas of the forest provided the best materials for different purposes. The wilderness was not just a backdrop for his construction project. It was a vast library of knowledge waiting to be read by anyone willing to learn its language. Working one-handed forced Samuel to become more ingenious in his building methods. He developed new ways to leverage heavy timbers into place, created pulley systems that required less direct force, and learned to pace himself more carefully. The injury that had seemed like a catastrophe became a teacher, showing him that limitations could spark creativity rather than defeat it. Chester the squirrel seemed to sense Samuel's vulnerability and began staying closer to the work site, as if standing guard. Bruno the bear appeared more frequently, sometimes sitting at the clearing's edge for hours, a massive and oddly comforting presence. Even the ravens that lived in the tall pines began dropping twigs and small objects near Samuel's workspace, as if contributing to the construction effort. As his wrist slowly healed over the course of 2 weeks, Samuel realized that his relationship with the mountain wilderness had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just surviving in it or building upon it. He was becoming part of it, learning to read its moods and seasons, understanding its rhythms and resources. The old medicine bottle sat on a shelf he had built inside the partially reconstructed cabin, a reminder of the knowledge that connected him to everyone who had ever called this place home. Samuel was not the first person to face challenges here, and he would not be the last. But he was learning that the land itself was a teacher, offering its lessons to anyone brave enough to listen and humble enough to learn. Samuel was splitting kindling behind the partially rebuilt cabin when he heard the sound that had become foreign to his ears after weeks of wilderness solitude, a human voice calling for help. The cry was weak and desperate, coming from somewhere beyond the eastern ridge, where the old railroad track wound through the forest. Setting down his axe, Samuel listened carefully. The call came again, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of someone crashing through underbrush with little regard for stealth or safety. Samuel's first instinct was to hide. He had grown comfortable with his isolation and was not certain he wanted to share his secret project with the outside world. But his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. A man's character is measured by what he does when no one is watching, and by how he treats those who need help. Samuel grabbed his water bottle and a handful of wild berries, then headed toward the sounds of distress. He found the stranger collapsed beside the old railroad grade, a man in his 60s wearing expensive hiking gear that had been shredded by brambles and rough travel. Blood seeped through a makeshift bandage on his left leg, and his face was pale with exhaustion and pain. "Please," the man gasped when he saw Samuel approaching. "I've been lost for 2 days. My GPS died, and I took a bad fall yesterday. I think my leg might be broken." Samuel knelt beside the injured hiker, his mind automatically shifting into the emergency procedures his grandfather had taught him. The man's breathing was shallow but steady, his pulse rapid but strong. The leg injury looked serious but not life-threatening. "My name's Samuel," he said, offering the man water. "Let me take a look at that leg." The hiker's eyes widened as he really looked at Samuel for the first time. "You're just a kid. What are you doing out here alone?" "Same thing you are, I expect," Samuel replied diplomatically. "Try to survive." He carefully examined the injured leg, noting the swelling and unnatural angle that suggested a fracture below the knee. "This needs proper medical attention, but I can help stabilize it for now." As Samuel worked to splint the man's leg using techniques his grandfather had taught him, The hiker studied his young rescuer with growing amazement. "You seem to know what you're doing. Are you camping nearby?" Samuel gestured toward the clearing where his cabin reconstruction project was taking shape. "I live over there." When the man saw the partially rebuilt structure, his reaction was not what Samuel had expected. Instead of surprise or concern about a child living alone in the wilderness, the hiker's face filled with recognition and something that looked like reverence. "My God," he whispered, "that's Jim Morrison's place. I never thought I'd see it again." Samuel stopped working on the splint and stared at his patient. "You knew James Morrison?" "Knew him." The man laughed weakly. "Jim Morrison saved my life in Korea. I'm Henry Walsh. We served together in the 2nd Infantry Division." He pulled a set of tarnished dog tags from beneath his shirt. "Jim gave me these when he thought he wasn't going to make it through a particularly bad battle. Said his family should know what happened to him if I made it home. And he didn't." Samuel's hands trembled as he finished securing the splint. "He made a home. He built this cabin for his family." Henry nodded slowly. "I heard about that. Heard he was trying to start over, get away from the nightmares and the crowds. A lot of us had trouble readjusting after the war. Jim had it worse than most. He saw things, did things that no man should have to carry alone." Over the next several hours, as Henry rested and recovered his strength, he told Samuel stories about James Morrison that the journal had never revealed. Jim had been a demolitions expert, skilled at building and destroying with equal expertise. He had also been a man haunted by the destruction he had caused, desperate to create something beautiful and lasting to balance the scales of his conscience. "Jim was the best combat engineer I ever knew," Henry said, accepting another cup of willow bark tea that Samuel had prepared. "He could build a bridge out of bamboo and rope that would hold a tank or level a mountain with explosives and precision timing. But what he really wanted was to build something that would last, something that would shelter the people he loved instead of destroying the people he was ordered to fight." As evening approached, Henry examined Samuel's reconstruction work with the eyes of someone who understood both construction and the man who had originally built here. "You're doing good work, son. Jim will be proud to see his place being restored with such care and skill." Samuel helped Henry down to the clearing where the injured man could rest more comfortably while they decided what to do about getting him to medical care. But before they reached the cabin, Henry made an observation that changed Samuel's understanding of his entire project. "You know," Henry said, studying the precisely fitted logs and carefully crafted joints, "this isn't just rebuilding. This is honoring something. Jim always said that every building carries the soul of its maker. You're not just fixing his cabin, son. You're completing his dream." The first snowflakes began falling on a gray October morning while Samuel was installing the handmade weather vane on the cabin's newly completed roof. From his perch 20 feet above the ground, he watched the delicate white crystals drift down through the pine branches, each one a harbinger of the brutal winter that would soon grip the Colorado mountains. Henry Walsh had been gone for 3 days, carried out of the wilderness by a search and rescue team that Samuel had helped summon using Henry's emergency beacon. Before leaving, Henry had given Samuel something precious: James Morrison's original military dog tags and a promise to keep the boy's location secret until spring. "A man needs to finish what he starts," Henry had said. Jim would understand that better than anyone. Now alone again in his mountain sanctuary, Samuel felt the weight of approaching winter like a physical presence. The weather vane he was installing had been forged from an old railroad spike, its arrow pointing steadily north toward the peaks already white with snow. It would serve both as a functional tool for reading wind patterns and as a symbol of his determination to weather whatever storms lay ahead. The cabin was nearly complete, but nearly would not be sufficient when the temperature dropped below zero and the snow began accumulating in earnest. Samuel had perhaps 2 weeks to finish the critical weatherproofing, sealing the final gaps between logs, installing the last windows he had salvaged and repaired, and ensuring that his chimney drew properly under all conditions. Working with renewed urgency, Samuel tackled each remaining task with methodical precision. He mixed mortar from clay he had found along the stream bank, adding lime from crushed limestone and horsehair from the tail of a wild horse he had befriended. The mixture would seal the spaces between logs, preventing wind and moisture from penetrating his walls. The windows presented a particular challenge. Samuel had found several intact window frames in the cabin's debris, but most of the glass was broken. Using techniques he had learned from his grandfather and refined through trial and error, he cut new panes from a piece of plate glass salvaged from an old truck windshield he had discovered near the railroad track. Each piece had to be measured precisely, cut with patience, and installed with care. As he worked, Samuel found himself thinking about the stories Henry had shared about James Morrison. The original builder had been a man driven by demons, seeking peace through the act of creation. Samuel understood that drive now. Each board he fitted, each stone he placed, each joint he sealed was not just construction work. It was an act of faith in the future, a declaration that permanence was possible, even in a world that seemed determined to tear things apart. The forest animals that had become his companions seemed to sense the urgency of his work. Chester the squirrel spent less time chattering and more time gathering nuts for winter storage. Bruno the bear appeared more frequently, as if checking on Samuel's progress before beginning his own preparations for hibernation. Even the ravens worked with unusual intensity, gathering materials for winter nests and caching food in hidden locations. Samuel's daily routine became a race against time and weather. He woke before dawn and worked until darkness, taking breaks only for quick meals and the brief rest periods his body demanded. His hands, already tough from weeks of manual labor, developed new calluses and scars. His shoulders and back ached constantly from lifting and fitting heavy timbers, but his spirit soared with each completed task. The root cellar behind the cabin became his focus for food storage. Samuel had spent weeks gathering wild nuts, drying berries, and smoking fish caught in a mountain stream. He had also learned to preserve meat from small game using techniques his grandfather had taught him, combined with methods he found described in James Morrison's journal. The cellar would keep his supplies frozen through the winter months, ensuring he would not starve before spring. Firewood presented another massive challenge. Samuel calculated that he would need at least 10 full cords of seasoned wood to heat the cabin through a mountain winter. Working alone with hand tools, cutting and splitting that much would seem impossible. But Samuel had learned that impossible was simply another word for difficult, and difficult problems yielded to patience and determination. He established a rhythm. Mornings for construction work while his energy was highest, afternoons for wood cutting and splitting, evenings for maintenance tasks like tool sharpening and equipment repair. Each day brought visible progress, but each day also brought the temperature a few degrees lower and the snow line a few hundred feet closer to his elevation. On the evening when Samuel installed the final window, sealing the last major opening in his fortress against winter, he stood back and surveyed what he had accomplished. The cabin stood solid and true, its walls tight and its roof sound. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney, and warm light glowed from windows that would keep out the worst weather the mountains could deliver. Samuel touched the weather vane's arrow as it swung in the evening breeze, pointing toward the challenges that lay ahead. Winter was coming, but he was ready. The storm began as a whisper of wind through the pine tops, so gentle that Samuel almost ignored it while he carved the final details into a wooden cross he had been working on during the long evenings. He had made the cross from a piece of heartwood salvaged from James Morrison's original construction, and it was intended as both a memorial to the cabin's first builder and a symbol of gratitude for his own survival. But the whisper became a moan, then a howl, and by midnight, the first blizzard of winter was unleashing its full fury on the mountain wilderness. Samuel had experienced mountain storms before, but nothing had prepared him for the raw power of this early-season hurricane of snow and wind. The cabin shuddered under the assault. Wind-driven snow found every tiny gap in the construction, creating small drifts in corners where Samuel thought he had achieved perfect sealing. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that the stones of the fireplace contracted with sharp cracking sounds, and frost began forming on the interior walls despite the fire burning steadily in the hearth. Samuel spent the first night of the storm moving constantly through the cabin. monitoring for problems and making small repairs as they became necessary. A piece of metal roofing worked loose and had to be secured with additional nails driven through the storm. A window frame shifted slightly under the pressure, requiring new chinking to maintain the seal. The chimney drew inconsistently as the wind changed direction, sometimes filling the cabin with smoke that made his eyes water and his throat burn. By dawn, 3 feet of snow had accumulated around the cabin walls, and the storm showed no signs of weakening. Samuel realized with growing concern that this might be more than a typical early winter squall. The weather vane he had installed spun wildly, unable to settle on any direction as the wind swirled and eddied around the clearing. On the second day, the real test began. The weight of accumulating snow stressed the roof structure, and Samuel could hear the timbers groaning under the load. He had built the roof strong, following James Morrison's original design and reinforcing it with additional supports, but he had never expected to face such conditions so early in the season. Working by firelight, Samuel used techniques his grandfather had taught him for emergency repairs. He braced the ceiling joists with additional supports cut from his carefully hoarded lumber supply. He redistributed the load by creating new support points where the stress seemed greatest. Most importantly, he maintained his calm and worked methodically, never allowing panic to cloud his judgment. The third night brought the storm's most dangerous phase. The wind reached velocities that seemed impossible, shaking the entire cabin like a toy in the hands of an angry giant. Samuel lay awake, listening to trees falling in the forest around him, massive pines that had stood for decades crashing to earth with sounds like thunder. At some point during that endless night, Samuel realized that his survival was no longer certain. The cabin was holding, but barely. If the roof failed or the walls buckled, he would face the storm with only the clothes on his back and whatever supplies he could grab in the final moments. The nearest shelter was 40 miles away through terrain that would be impossible in these conditions. It was then that Samuel reached for the wooden cross he had been carving, holding it in his hands as he had seen his grandfather do during moments of uncertainty. The old man had not been particularly religious, but he had understood the power of ritual and symbol to focus the mind and strengthen the spirit. "If I don't make it through this," Samuel whispered to the wooden cross, "let someone find this place and know that I tried. Let them know that James Morrison's dream was worth rebuilding, even if I wasn't strong enough to see it through." But as dawn broke on the fourth day, the wind began to moderate. The snow continued falling, but without the driving force that had made a weapon. Samuel ventured outside for the first time in 3 days and found a transformed world. The cabin sat in a bowl of white that reached nearly to the windows. Drifts had formed against the north wall that were taller than Samuel himself. More importantly, the cabin had held. Every joint remained tight, every window intact, every support beam strong and true. The roof showed no signs of stress damage, and the chimney continued to draw properly despite being nearly buried in snow. Standing in the doorway, looking out at a wilderness made alien by the storm's fury, Samuel felt a profound sense of accomplishment that went beyond mere survival. He had built something that could withstand the worst nature could deliver. More than that, he had proven to himself that the skills and values his grandfather had taught him were not just old-fashioned wisdom, but practical tools for creating something permanent in an impermanent world. Samuel placed the wooden cross on a shelf beside James Morrison's photograph, a reminder that some dreams are strong enough to survive any storm. Spring came to the mountains like a gentle awakening after a long dream. Samuel first noticed it in the changing quality of light that filtered through his cabin windows. No longer the harsh glare of sun on snow, but the softer illumination of longer days and melting ice. The sounds changed too. The drip of water from eaves, the distant murmur of the stream running free again, and somewhere in the forest, the tentative calls of birds returning from their winter refuges. Samuel had survived. More than survived, he had thrived. The long winter months had been a time of reflection and quiet productivity. He had spent the short days carving furniture from salvaged wood, crafting tools and utensils, and reading James Morrison's journal again and again until he felt he knew the man like family. The long evenings had been filled with planning improvements for the coming year and dreaming of the garden he would plant when the ground thawed. The cabin had proven itself through months of brutal weather. Not once had the roof leaked or the walls shifted. The fireplace had drawn perfectly through the worst storms, and the carefully sealed windows had kept out wind and cold while letting in precious light. Samuel had created something worthy of pride, something that honored both his grandfather's teachings and James Morrison's original vision. On a warm morning in early April, when the snow had retreated to patches in the deepest shadows, Samuel heard voices approaching through the forest. He recognized them as human long before they reached his clearing. But after months of solitude, the sound seemed as foreign as bird calls in a different language. 3 hikers emerged from the trees, a middle-aged couple and their teenage son, all wearing expensive outdoor gear and carrying lightweight packs. They stopped at the edge of the clearing and stared in amazement at what they found there. The cabin stood like something from a fairy tale, perfectly proportioned and beautifully crafted. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight column in the still air. Window boxes that Samuel had built and installed held the first green shoots of wild plants he had transplanted from the forest. A neat wood pile stood against the south wall, and a garden plot had been prepared and planted with seeds Samuel had collected and saved. "My God," the woman whispered. "Look at the craftsmanship. Those joints are perfect. And is that hand-split roofing?" Samuel appeared in the doorway, wearing clothes he had mended and patched through the winter, but carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had proven his capabilities beyond any doubt. He was taller than he had been 6 months earlier, broader in the shoulders, and his hands bore the permanent marks of skilled manual labor. "Good morning," he said politely, the way his grandfather had taught him to greet visitors. "Welcome to my home." The family exchanged glances of confusion and amazement. "Your home?" the father asked. "Son, how old are you?" 13 last month, Samuel replied. "I built this place myself, though I had help from someone who came before me." As the morning progressed, Samuel told his story to the fascinated hikers. He showed them through the cabin, explaining how he had salvaged materials, solved engineering problems, and survived the winter alone. He shared the story of James Morrison and the legacy that had inspired his work. Most importantly, he demonstrated that he was not a lost child in need of rescue, but a capable young man who had found his place in the world. The teenage son was particularly impressed by Samuel's workshop, where hand-forged tools hung in neat rows and half-finished projects demonstrated ongoing creativity and skill. "How did you learn to do all this?" he asked. "My grandfather taught me the basics," Samuel replied. "The rest I figured out as I went along." When you have no choice but to solve a problem, you discover you're more capable than you ever imagined. Before the family left, they helped Samuel plant wildflower seeds around the cabin's perimeter. The woman had brought a packet of mixed seeds for her own garden, but she insisted that Samuel's home deserved flowers. As they worked together in the warm dirt, Samuel felt a connection to the wider world that he had not experienced since his abandonment. "Will you stay here?" the father asked as they prepared to continue their hike. Samuel looked around at the clearing where he had spent the most transformative months of his life. The cabin stood solid and welcoming, a testament to the power of determination and skill. The forest around it had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. This place had become more than shelter. It had become home in the deepest sense of the word. "For now," Samuel said, "there's still work to do, and I want to see how the garden grows." As the hikers disappeared back into the forest, Samuel stood beside his cabin holding a handful of wildflower seeds. Tomorrow he would plant them in the spots that needed color. Next week he would begin work on the lean-to addition he had planned. Next month he would start the project of building furniture for the second bedroom. Samuel had learned that home was not something you were given, but something you created with your own hands and filled with your own dreams. The wildflower seeds were just the beginning. The discovery happened by accident, as the most meaningful findings often do. Samuel was digging a new drainage channel to direct spring runoff away from the cabin's foundation when his shovel struck something harder than dirt or stone. Kneeling in the rich earth that smelled of snow melt and awakening life, He carefully brushed away the soil to reveal a carved cornerstone that had been buried beneath decades of accumulated debris. The stone was granite, probably quarried from the mountains nearby, and someone had taken considerable time to shape and engrave it. On its face, carved in letters deep enough to survive weather and time, Samuel read, J. Morrison, 1943, built with hope. Below the inscription, someone had carved a simple symbol, two hands clasped in partnership, representing the cooperation between builder and land that made permanent shelter possible. Samuel sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the weight of this discovery. This was not just James Morrison's signature on his work. It was his declaration of faith in the future, his belief that what he was creating would outlast the troubles that had driven him to seek peace in the wilderness. The cornerstone had been placed with ceremony and intention, marking the moment when dream became reality. Working carefully through the afternoon, Samuel excavated around the stone until he could see how it had been positioned within the original foundation. Morrison had placed it at the southeast corner where the morning sun would touch it first each day. The stone had been set in a bed of smaller rocks, creating a foundation that was both functional and symbolic. As Samuel cleaned the carved letters with a soft brush, he noticed something else. Faint marks scratched into the stone surface that were not part of the original inscription. Looking closer, he realized these were tally marks, dozens of them arranged in groups of 5. Someone had been counting something, marking days or weeks or months directly onto the cornerstone. That evening, by the light of his oil lamp, Samuel counted the marks carefully. There were exactly 120 of them, the same number of days he had spent rebuilding the cabin. James Morrison had marked each day of his own construction project on this stone, creating a record of persistence and determination that Samuel now shared. The realization filled Samuel with a profound sense of connection that transcended time and circumstance. He and James Morrison had faced similar challenges, felt similar doubts, and found similar strength in the daily act of building something permanent. The cornerstone was not just a marker of Morrison's achievement. It was a bridge between past and present, connecting two builders across the decades. Samuel spent the next several days researching what he could learn about cornerstones and their significance in building traditions. Using books he had found in the cabin's debris and knowledge his grandfather had shared, he discovered that cornerstone ceremonies had been practiced for thousands of years. Ancient builders believed that the cornerstone contained the soul of the building, and that proper placement ensured the structure would stand against all challenges. Understanding this tradition, Samuel realized he had a choice to make. He could leave the stone where it had slept for 82 years, hidden beneath moss and memory, or he could raise it into the light and finish what James Morrison had started. He could restore Morrison's cornerstone to its original position, honoring the past and maintaining the connection to the cabin's first builder, where he could place his own cornerstone alongside Morrison's, marking his own contribution to the building story. The decision came to him during a morning walk through the forest, where he noticed how new trees often grew beside the stumps of their predecessors, creating continuity while adding fresh life to the woodland community. The cabin could honor both its original builder and its restorer without diminishing either contribution. Samuel spent a week preparing his own cornerstone. Carved from granite, he quarried himself using techniques Morrison had described in his journal. The work was slow and painstaking, requiring precision and patience. On a stone, Samuel carved, S. Walker 2024, built with gratitude. Below the inscription, he added his own symbol. A compass rose pointing in all directions, representing the guidance he had received from past wisdom and his commitment to sharing that wisdom with future generations. The ceremony of placing both cornerstones took place on a clear morning when the mountain air was sweet with the scent of pine and wildflowers. Samuel positioned Morrison's stone in its original location, then placed his own beside it at the southwest corner. Together, the stones created a foundation that honored both past and present, linking the dreams of two builders across generations. On the first morning warm enough to work shirtless, Samuel built a small fire of cedar kindling. The smoke rising sweet and thin, The way incense must have risen over Solomon's temple. He wrapped Morrison's cornerstone in the last scrap of his grandfather's red plaid shirt, carried it to the southeast corner like a newborn, and lowered it into the cradle of fresh lime mortar he had mixed at dawn. The stones settled with a soft, satisfied sigh, the carved letters catching the first shaft of sunrise exactly as Morrison had planned. Samuel took the cold chisel he had forged from a railroad spike, the same spike that had become his garden hoe, and beneath Morrison's name, he struck his own. Eli Red Hawk, 2025, rebuilt with the same. Then, while the forest held its breath, he did what the old ones always did. He marked the first day. One clean stroke beside the clasped hands. A single line, bright as hope, deep as promise. As Samuel stood back and surveyed his work, he understood that he had become more than just the cabin's restorer. He had become its historian, its protector, and its bridge to whatever future awaited this place. The cornerstones would outlast both builders, carrying their stories forward to inspire others who might face similar challenges and choose similar courage. Chester the squirrel chittered approval from his perch in the nearby pine, and somewhere in the forest birds sang the ancient songs of renewal and continuity. The cabin now had roots that reached deeper than its physical foundation, anchored in the bedrock of human determination and hope. The two sets of symbols complemented each other, telling the story of a building that had been loved by multiple generations of builders. Morrison's marks spoke of hope and determination in the face of post-war trauma. Samuel's marks spoke of resilience and growth in the face of abandonment and isolation. Samuel understood that he had become part of something larger than his individual story. The cabin now carried the dreams and efforts of two builders, each contributing their unique skills and perspectives to the structure's evolution. Future builders would add their own marks, continuing the conversation between craftsmen across time. The carved symbols glowed in the lamplight, fresh cuts in seasoned wood that would darken and weather until they became indistinguishable from the original construction. Samuel's mark would age into permanence, becoming part of the cabin's fundamental identity rather than a superficial addition. Putting away his carving tools, Samuel felt the satisfaction that came from completing something that would outlast his own lifetime. His builder's mark was more than decoration or ego. It was a promise to future generations that someone had cared enough to build well, and an invitation for others to continue the tradition of craftsmanship and dedication that made permanent beauty possible. The chisel Samuel used to carve his builder's mark into the main beam of his cabin had been forged from the same railroad spike that had provided metal for his garden hoe. He had shaped it specifically for this purpose, creating a tool that was both functional and ceremonial, designed to leave a permanent record of his contribution to the cabin's continuing story. The decision to add his mark to the structure had not come easily. For weeks, Samuel had wrestled with questions of appropriateness and legacy. The cabin was fundamentally James Morrison's creation, built from Morrison's vision and sweat. Samuel had restored and improved it. But did that give him the right to claim permanent recognition alongside the original builder? The answer came to him while reading Morrison's journal on a quiet spring evening. In an entry dated September 1943, Morrison had written, "A building is never really finished, just passed from one caretaker to the next. Someday another man will work on these walls, and I hope he'll understand that he's not just maintaining a structure, but continuing a conversation between builders across time." Morrison had intended for others to add their contributions to his work. The cabin was designed to grow and evolve, to serve the needs of whoever cared enough to maintain and improve it. Samuel's restoration was not a violation of Morrison's legacy, but a fulfillment of his hopes for the structure's future. Samuel chose to place his mark on the main support beam that ran along the cabin's ridge line, the timber that bore the greatest structural load and would be the last component to require replacement. He selected a spot where the wood was smooth and unblemished, close enough to Morrison's original carpenter's marks to show connection, but distinct enough to represent his own contribution. The mark Samuel designed for himself was simple but meaningful, A compass rose with 8 points representing the guidance he had received from all directions during his wilderness journey. The symbol acknowledged his grandfather's teachings, Morrison's example, the wisdom of the forest animals, and the lessons learned from the land itself. At the center of the compass rose, Samuel carved his initials and the year of his restoration. The actual carving required 3 evenings of careful work. Samuel wanted the mark to be deep enough to last for decades, but not so deep as to weaken the structural beam. Each cut had to be precise, following the wood grain to prevent cracking and ensuring that the lines were clean and permanent. As he worked, Samuel found himself thinking about the nature of legacy and permanence. The physical marks he was carving would outlast his own presence in this place, carrying his story forward to whoever might discover the cabin in years or decades to come. But the real legacy was not in the carved symbols, but in the skills and values that had guided the work. Samuel had learned from his grandfather that true building was about more than creating structures. It was about developing the character and capabilities that made lasting construction possible. The cabin represented not just shelter, but proof that determination, skill, and respect for materials could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Working by lamplight with the sharp chisel, Samuel carved more than just his initials into the beam. He was inscribing a record of transformation, marking the place where an abandoned child had become a capable young man. The mark would serve as inspiration for future builders who might face their own seemingly impossible challenges. On the final evening of carving, Samuel added one more element to his builder's mark, a small date palm tree. The symbol his grandfather had taught him represented growth and resilience in harsh conditions. The palm tree would remind anyone who found the mark that Samuel had not just restored a building, but had grown into something stronger through the process. When the carving was complete, Samuel stood back and examined his work alongside Morrison's original marks. The ridge beam caught the last of the sun like it had been waiting for this moment since 1943. Samuel ran his thumb over the fresh carving. Compass rose crisp as frost, 8 points sharp enough to draw blood if you weren't careful. At its heart, S.W. 2024-25. Beneath the lowest ray, the tiny palm trees stood straight and defiant, fronds etched so fine they seemed to flutter in the draft from the chimney. He placed it exactly 3 hand widths from Morrison's own mark, a simple J.M, inside a rough square, cut the day the ridgepole went up. Close enough that a careful eye would see the conversation. Far enough that no one could mistake one voice for the other. Morrison, this is mine. Samuel, and now it's ours. The chisel, still warm from his grip, went back into the leather roll beside the hoe that had started life as the same railroad spike. 1 piece of iron, 3 lives now. Spike, hoe, chisel. Henry Walsh found him there at dusk, squinting up at the beam like a man reading scripture in a foreign tongue. Palm tree, huh? The old soldier said, voice rough with coffee and chokecherry pie. Your grandpa's mark? Samuel nodded, said they grow where nothing else will. Bend but don't break. Henry studied the carving a long time, then pulled his own knife, the same one that had carved his initials into 1,000 barracks walls from Chosin to Billings, and reached up. Without asking, because some things don't need asking, he added a tiny H.W, just below the palm, small enough to miss if you didn't know look. Every caretaker gets a say, he muttered. That's the rule. The forest held its breath. Samuel lifted the children one by one, Lily, Jonah, Mason, the twins, so each could add their own crooked initials. 5 sets of letters now lived on the ridgepole, linked by compass points and palm fronds and the stubborn refusal to let the story end. Henry cleared his throat. Reckon we ought to leave room for the next ones. Samuel smiled, the kind that started in his chest and worked its way out slow. Already did. He pointed to the empty stretch of beam running east toward the new addition they'd framed last week. Space for 20 more names, maybe 30. Enough for every kid who ever walked up the trail with nothing but blisters and hope. That night they left the door open so the wind could read the marks too. The flutes came out, 6 now, because Henry had brought a cedar one he'd carved on the long ride up. They played the song that belonged to no one and everyone, the one that started with a boy alone and ended with a table too small for all the voices. When the moon rose full and silver over the ridge, it lit the beam like a spotlight. J.M. SWHWLR JR M.H. And a long stretch of clean wood waiting for whoever came next. The basket took Samuel 3 weeks to complete, working in the evenings by firelight when the day's construction tasks were finished. He had started the project out of necessity, needing something to carry wild berries and nuts during his foraging expeditions. But as the work progressed, it became something much more significant, a meditation on patience, tradition, and the satisfaction that comes from creating beauty with one's own hands. Samuel had learned the basics of basket weaving from his grandfather during one of their summer sessions. But those childhood lessons had focused more on the principles than the practice. Now, working alone in his mountain cabin with only memory and determination as guides, Samuel rediscovered the ancient rhythm of weaving plant fibers into useful forms. The materials came from the forest around his clearing. Young willow shoots provided the flexible framework, while strips of birch bark and pine needles created the weaving medium. Samuel gathered these materials during his daily walks, learning to read the forest like a catalog of available resources. Each tree, each shrub, each ground cover plant offered something useful to someone willing to learn its properties. The actual weaving required a patience that modern life had never taught Samuel to cultivate. Each strand had to be selected for strength and flexibility, then worked into the growing pattern with care and attention. Mistakes could not simply be erased and corrected. They had to be unwoven strand by strand until the error was removed and the work could continue. During the long evenings of basket construction, Samuel found his mind settling into a meditative state that his grandfather had called the craftsman's peace. The repetitive motions of weaving became automatic, freeing his thoughts to wander through memories and plans, problems and possibilities. He understood why traditional craftspeople had spoken of their work as spiritual practice as much as practical skill. The finished basket was beautiful in its simplicity, perfectly proportioned and strong enough to carry considerable weight. But more than a useful tool, it represented Samuel's growing independence from the manufactured world. He was learning to create everything he needed from materials the earth provided freely to anyone willing to invest time and effort in learning traditional skills. The basket project sparked others. Samuel began making rope from twisted plant fibers using techniques he found described in James Morrison's journal and refined through experimentation. He carved wooden bowls and spoons from fallen timber, each piece shaped to fit his hands and serve his specific needs. He learned to make soap from wood ash and animal fat, candles from rendered tallow, and dyes from berries and bark. Each new skill connected Samuel to generations of people who had lived from the land, creating what they needed rather than purchasing what others had made. He began to understand that self-sufficiency was not just about survival. It was about maintaining connection to the fundamental processes that sustained human life. When you made your own tools, grew your own food, and built your own shelter, you understood your place in the natural world in ways that no amount of book learning could provide. The workshop area of his cabin gradually filled with the tools and products of his expanding craftsmanship. Hand-forged chisels hung beside carved wooden mallets. Coiled rope sat next to bundles of prepared fiber. Finished baskets in various sizes served different purposes: berry gathering, root storage, firewood carrying, and general transport. Samuel's daily routine expanded to include maintenance and creation of his growing inventory of handmade goods. Morning hours were devoted to essential tasks: tending his garden, maintaining the cabin structure, and gathering food. Afternoons involved heavier work: cutting firewood, hauling water, and major construction projects. But evenings belonged to craft work, the quiet hours when his hands could create beauty while his mind processed the experiences of each day. Visitors to the cabin, which were becoming more frequent as word of Samuel's achievement spread among hikers and outdoor enthusiasts, were always amazed by the completeness of his self-sufficient lifestyle. They saw not just a rebuilt cabin, but an entire way of life that demonstrated what was possible when someone committed fully to living from their own skills and the resources of the land. One evening, as Samuel worked on a new basket while rain drummed against his windows, he realized that he had achieved something remarkable. He was no longer dependent on the outside world for his basic needs. Food, shelter, tools, clothing, medicine, and entertainment all came from his own efforts and the generous abundance of the mountain wilderness. The hand-woven basket sitting beside his chair represented more than portable storage. It symbolized the possibility of true independence, the kind of self-reliance that his grandfather had taught him to value above all other achievements. Samuel had learned that freedom was not something granted by others, but something created through knowledge, skill, and the willingness to work with one's hands. Outside his warm cabin, the forest settled into evening quiet, and Samuel continued weaving, adding another strand to the growing pattern of his mountain life. The idea for the flute came to Samuel during one of the longest nights of winter, when the silence outside his cabin felt so complete that it seemed to press against the walls like a living thing. He had been reading James Morrison's journal by lamplight, searching for techniques to improve his woodworking skills, when he found an entry that stopped him cold. February 14th, 1944. Made a whistle for Tommy today from piece of birch. The boy's been so quiet since Mary took him to town for supplies. Says the silence here scares him sometimes. Music helps, asterisk, asterisk. Even simple music reminds us that humans make beauty, not just shelter. Samuel set down the journal and listened to the profound quiet surrounding his cabin. Snow muffled every sound from the outside world, and the only noise came from the settling of timbers and the occasional pop of sap in the fireplace logs. He had grown accustomed to the silence, even found comfort in it. But Morrison's words made him realize what was missing: the human element of joy and celebration that music represents. The next morning, Samuel began searching the forest for the right piece of wood for a flute. His grandfather had never taught him instrument making, but he had shown Samuel how to read wood grain and select materials for specific purposes. A flute would require wood that was both resonant and workable, dense enough to produce clear tones, but soft enough to carve with precision. He found what he needed in a fallen apple tree that had somehow taken root in the mountain soil decades earlier, probably grown from seeds carried by birds or early settlers. The wood was seasoned to perfection by years of mountain weather, and when Samuel tapped it with his knuckle, it rang with a clear musical tone that promised good acoustic properties. Carving the flute became Samuel's winter project, a task he approached during the shortest days when outdoor work was limited and the evenings stretched endlessly toward spring. Using techniques adapted from his general woodworking knowledge, Samuel slowly shaped the piece of applewood into an instrument. The work required a delicacy he had never needed for construction projects. Every cut had to be precise, every surface smooth, every hole positioned exactly to produce the proper pitch. Samuel made dozens of small mistakes and had to start over twice when errors became too significant to correct. But each failure taught him something about the relationship between form and function that applied to all craftsmanship. The mathematical precision required for proper hole placement challenged Samuel in new ways. He had to learn about ratios and proportions, discovering that music followed natural laws as predictable as those governing structural engineering. The distance between holes determined the intervals between notes, and those intervals had to follow patterns that produced harmony rather than discord. As winter progressed and the flute took shape, Samuel found himself looking forward to the evening carving sessions with anticipation that surprised him. After months of practical work focused on survival and shelter, the act of creating something purely for beauty and joy felt like a luxury almost too precious to allow himself. When Samuel finally carved the last hole and smoothed the final surface, he held in his hands an instrument that was unmistakably his own creation. The wood gleamed with the patina that came from hours of careful handling, and the proportions reflected his own hands and breath rather than any standardized measurements. The first notes Samuel coaxed from his handmade flute were tentative and breathy, more sigh than music. But as he learned to control his breathing and finger placement, actual melodies began to emerge. Simple folk tunes his grandfather had hummed during their work sessions, traditional songs his mother had sung during the brief happy periods of his childhood, new melodies that seemed to flow from the mountains themselves. Music transformed Samuel's relationship with solitude. Where silence had once felt complete and sufficient, he now understood it as a canvas waiting for the human voice of melody and rhythm. The flute became his companion during long winter evenings, filling the cabin with sounds that connected him to the broader human experience of making beauty from simple materials. Playing the flute also connected Samuel to the emotional landscape he had largely ignored while focused on physical survival. Music had a way of accessing feelings that practical work kept buried. Loneliness, wonder, gratitude, and a deep appreciation for the strange journey that had brought him to this place of independence and peace. On clear nights, Samuel took his flute outside and played simple melodies under the star-filled mountain sky. The notes seemed to carry for miles in the thin air, creating connections with the vast wilderness that surrounded his small clearing. The wooden flute represented something Samuel was just beginning to understand, that survival was not enough, and neither was mere comfort. Human beings needed beauty, creativity, and the expression of joy to make life complete. The flute was his declaration that he was not just surviving in the wilderness, but truly living there. The first true song came on the night the temperature dropped so low the stars looked close enough to touch. Samuel sat on the hearth rug, back against the warm stones, flute across his knees. Outside, the wind had quit entirely, the kind of cold that makes metal brittle and breath hang in silver clouds. Inside, the fire painted everything gold and shadow. He lifted the apple wood to his lips and played what the mountain had taught him. The notes weren't the neat, tidy scales he'd practiced. They were rough-edged, alive. The high, lonely cry of a hawk over the ridge, the low rumble of snow sliding off pine boughs, the heartbeat thud of his own blood when the big storm tried to fold the roof like paper. He played the day the first corn ear-ripened. He played the moment Bruno left the cedar shingle on the step like a housewarming gift. The flute didn't care that his fingers were calloused or that his nails were split to the quick. It only cared that he meant every note. When he finally lowered it, the silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was listening. Somewhere in the dark, a wolf answered, one long, rising howl that braided itself around the last note and carried it clear to the ridge. Then another wolf, farther off. Then the whole pack singing back across the valley like they'd been waiting for permission. Samuel's eyes stung. He hadn't cried since the day his parents' taillights disappeared. Tonight the tears came easy, sliding hot down cold cheeks and hissing when they hit the hearthstones. Samuel's first garden hoe was a masterpiece of practical engineering, forged from a railroad spike during the long winter evenings when outdoor work was impossible. He had heated the iron in his fireplace until it glowed orange, then hammered it against a granite anvil he had positioned near the hearth. The blade was narrow but sharp, designed for the precise work of cultivating soil in the Rocky Mountain terrain around his cabin. Spring arrived late to the high country, but when it came, it brought an explosion of growth that transformed the mountain landscape almost overnight. Snow retreated to shadowed hollows, revealing earth that was rich and dark with decades of decomposed organic matter. Samuel had spent the winter studying seed catalogs and agricultural guides he had found among James Morrison's possessions, preparing for this moment when he could finally test his theories about mountain farming. The garden plot Samuel had chosen lay on the south-facing slope behind his cabin, where it would receive maximum sunlight during the short growing season. The soil was better than he had hoped, deep forest loam mixed with granite sand that provided excellent drainage. But it was also filled with roots, rocks, and the accumulated debris of years without cultivation. Breaking ground with his handmade hoe, Samuel discovered that gardening was unlike any other work he had undertaken. Construction projects had clear beginning and ending points with progress measured by visible completion of specific tasks. Gardening operated on natural rhythms that could not be rushed or controlled, demanding patience and faith in processes that unfolded over months rather than days. The physical work of preparing the garden plot was more challenging than Samuel had expected. Every square foot of soil had to be turned, examined, and cleared of obstacles. Rocks ranged from pebbles to boulders, each requiring different removal strategies. Root systems from nearby trees had to be cut and extracted without damaging the living trees themselves. Organic matter had to be incorporated evenly to ensure consistent soil fertility. Samuel worked section by section, completing small areas thoroughly before moving on to new ground. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Good farming starts with good soil preparation. You can't shortcut the foundation work and expect strong results. Each day brought visible progress, but each day also revealed new challenges that required creative solutions. The seeds Samuel planted came from multiple sources. Some were commercial varieties he had discovered in Morrison's abandoned supplies, carefully stored in sealed containers that had protected them from moisture and pests. Others were seeds he had collected during his autumn foraging expeditions, wild berries, edible roots, and native plants that were adapted to mountain conditions. Planting day arrived with the certainty of astronomical calculation. Samuel had learned to read the natural signs that mountain farmers had relied on for generations: soil temperature, day length, and the behavior of migrating birds. When the conditions aligned properly, he spent an entire day placing seeds in carefully measured rows, each variety positioned according to its specific needs for space, light, and water access. The waiting that followed planting was unlike anything Samuel had experienced. After months of immediate feedback from construction work, where each hammer blow produced visible results, gardening required faith in invisible processes. Seeds germinated in darkness, roots extended into unseen soil depths, and growth occurred too slowly to observe from day to day. Samuel developed new routines centered around garden care. Morning inspections to check for pest damage or disease, afternoon watering sessions when natural rainfall was insufficient, evening planting sessions where he recorded observations and planned improvements. The garden became a teacher, instructing him in patience, observation, and the subtle art of working with natural forces rather than against them. The first green shoots appeared 3 weeks after planting, emerging from the dark soil like tiny flags of victory. Samuel felt a joy unlike any he had experienced during his wilderness adventure. These plants represented hope made visible, the transformation of faith and work into living abundance. As the growing season progressed, Samuel learned to read his garden like a complex text written in the language of leaf color, growth patterns, and soil conditions. Healthy plants displayed characteristic vigor and resilience. Stressed plants showed distress signals that could be interpreted and addressed before serious problems developed. The garden hoe became Samuel's most treasured tool, an extension of his hands that allowed him to cultivate, weed, and harvest with precision and efficiency. Each morning he would spend time sharpening its blade and oiling its handle, maintaining the implement that connected him to the ancient tradition of growing food from soil and seed. By midsummer, Samuel's garden was producing more food than he could consume fresh. He learned preservation techniques from Morrison's journal and his own experimentation: drying, smoking, and root cellar storage. The garden had become more than a source of nutrition. It was a complete system that connected him to the seasonal rhythms that governed all life in the mountains. The first green blade pushed through the soil on the morning the robins came back. Samuel was on his knees, coffee long gone cold in the tin cup beside him, when he saw it. A pale spear of corn no thicker than a pine needle, trembling in the breeze like it wasn't sure the world was ready for it. He laughed out loud, startled crows out of the pines, and the sound felt foreign in his throat, like a note he'd forgotten the flute could play. By the end of that week, the garden had declared war on emptiness. Potatoes sent up furry leaves that smelled like childhood cellars. Beans twined up the willow trellises he'd woven the way Morrison's journal described. Squash vines sprawled with the confidence of invaders. Fat yellow blossoms opening like trumpet blasts every dawn. Carrots hid their secrets underground, but the feathery tops waved like flags of victory whenever the wind came down off the ridge. Samuel hoed between the rows at sunrise, the railroad spike blade singing through the loam with a sound like tearing silk. He'd learned to listen to the soil the way he listened to wood. Every clunk of a rock, every tug of a root told him a story. Some mornings he found bare prints along the edge, Bruno checking the perimeter, sampling a squash leaf or two, but never taking more than his share. Once he found a single cedar shingle laid neatly on the path, like payment for services rendered. He talked to the plants the way Morrison had talked to 8-year-old Tommy. Grow strong, little ones. The mountains watching, and they did. By midsummer, the garden was a riot of green and gold and impossible. Corn stood taller than Samuel's head, tassels whispering secrets to the wind. Beans hung in clusters heavy as grapes. The squash had conquered half the hillside, their fruits swelling like smug orange moons. He harvested the first new potatoes on the day the thunderheads built themselves into castles over the western ridge, digging them up with his hands because the hoe felt too brutal for something so perfect. That night he played the flute on the porch while the storm circled, but never quite broke. The notes floated out over the rows, over corn silk and bean blossoms, and the dark, rich earth that had decided to trust him after all. Lightning flickered on the horizon like a giant striking matches, and every flash lit the garden silver for a heartbeat. When the first rain finally came, soft and warm as breath, Samuel stood barefoot in the rows and let it soak him to the skin. Water beaded on the leaves and ran in rivulets between the mounds, carrying the smell of turned earth and green growing things straight into his bones. He thought of Morrison on his knees in this same dirt 82 years ago, planting hope in a world that had gone mad. Thought of his grandfather teaching him to listen to the land instead of bullying it. Thought of every abandoned kid who'd ever stood at the edge of some clearing and decided to stay anyway. The garden didn't care about any of that. It just grew. And Samuel, 13 going on ancient, hands scarred and earth-stained, heart twice the size it had any right to be, grew with it. When the corn was tall enough to hide in, he carved a sign from a slab of cedar and hung it over the gate he'd built from lodgepole pine. Red Hawk Place, established 1943 by J. Morrison, reclaimed 2024 by S. Walker and Company. Enter as stranger, leave as family. Underneath, in smaller letters he added every year. Planted with hope, harvested with gratitude, guarded by bears and children and the stubborn refusal to quit. Standing among his thriving plants with a well-worn hoe in his hands, Samuel understood that he had learned something profound about time, patience, and the rewards that come to those who work in partnership with natural cycles. The measuring stick Samuel carved from a straight piece of ashwood was precisely 18 inches long, marked with careful notches every quarter-inch along its length. He had made it initially for cabinet work, needing accurate measurements for the furniture he was building to complete his cabin's interior. But as he worked with the tool day after day, it became something more significant, a physical reminder of how much he had grown in ways that could not be measured with any conventional ruler. The project began when Samuel realized that his construction work was suffering from imprecision. The furniture he was building from salvaged lumber required joints that fit perfectly, measurements that were consistent across multiple pieces, and angles that were exactly square. Working by eye and intuition had served him well for rough construction, but fine woodworking demanded accuracy that only proper measuring tools could provide. Samuel carved the ruler during evening sessions over the course of a week, working by oil lamplight with his grandfather's finest carving tools. The ash wood had come from a tree that had fallen during the previous winter storms, seasoned by months of mountain weather into a piece that was both hard and stable. Each mark had to be positioned exactly using mathematical principles Samuel had learned in school but never expected to apply in wilderness construction. The process of creating accurate measurements from raw wood taught Samuel about the fundamental relationship between precision and quality. Each notch required careful measurement from the previous mark, and small errors accumulated quickly if he was not vigilant. By the time he finished the ruler, Samuel understood why craftsmen throughout history had treasured their measuring tools as much as their cutting implements. But the physical ruler was only part of what Samuel was learning to measure during his time in the mountains. As he used the tool for cabinet work and small repairs, he began thinking about the other kinds of growth that had occurred during his wilderness year. Changes that were real and significant, but could not be quantified with notches on a piece of wood. When Samuel had first arrived at the ruined cabin, he could barely lift a railroad tie by himself. Now he could move heavy timbers with leverage and technique, understanding how to work with materials rather than against them. His hands, once soft and clumsy with tools, had developed the calluses and muscle memory that came from months of skilled manual labor. More importantly, Samuel's capacity for problem-solving had expanded in ways that amazed him when he stopped to consider the progression. Early in his stay, a collapsed wall had seemed like an insurmountable disaster. Now he approached complex challenges with calm confidence, breaking large problems into manageable components and working through solutions methodically. Samuel began using his handmade ruler to mark significant milestones on a growth chart he carved into the cabin's main support post. But instead of measuring his physical height, he marked achievements that represented his developing capabilities. The day he completed the roof, the first successful fire he built in a rainstorm, the moment when he realized he was no longer afraid of being alone in the wilderness. Each mark on the post represented a moment when Samuel had discovered new strength or capability within himself. The spacing between marks showed how his rate of growth had accelerated as challenges increased and his confidence developed. What had seemed impossible at the beginning of his journey now felt like natural extensions of skills he had always possessed but never known how to access. The measuring process also helped Samuel understand the difference between external validation and internal development. In his previous life, growth had been measured by grades, test scores, and approval from adults who evaluated his progress according to standardized metrics. In the wilderness, Samuel had learned to measure himself against his own previous capabilities and the real-world demands of survival and construction. Using his ruler to plan new projects, Samuel realized that precision in measurement reflected precision in thinking. The careful attention required to mark accurate measurements had trained his mind to approach all problems with similar methodical care. Planning a cabinet required the same systematic thinking as planning a roof repair or organizing his winter food supplies. Samuel's growth chart on the cabin post became a source of inspiration during difficult moments. When faced with a new challenge that seemed beyond his abilities, he could look at the progression of marks and remember that every previous achievement had once seemed impossible. The ruler had become a tool for measuring not just wood and metal, but courage and determination. Every morning after chores, after the garden had been hoed, the goats milked, the flutes tuned, Samuel carried the stick to the twin cornerstones. He laid it flat across Morrison's granite, then across his own, then across the new one Henry had set last spring when the twins arrived. The ash spanned all three without a breath of space between. Same length, same hope, same stubborn refusal to be shorter than the dream. He used it on the kids the way his grandfather had once used a door frame and a pencil. Back up to the post, Lily. She rolled her eyes but obeyed, standing straight, while Samuel marked the stick with a fresh notch just above her head. 4 inches since snowfall, he announced. Jonah shoved her aside. My turn. Another notch. Another victory. Mason, now 15 and still growing like a weed on Miracle-Gro, had to stoop so the stick could reach. His mark sat a full hand above last year's. Even the twins got measured, giggling as Samuel balanced the stick on their tight black braids. The ash was running out of room. Every evening Samuel took the stick to the garden and laid it beside the tallest corn stalk, the thickest squash vine. The sunflower that had decided the sky was a suggestion, not a limit. The notches told the same story the plants did, slow, steady, unstoppable. One night in late August, when the corn stood twice his height and the moon hung fat and orange over the ridge, Samuel carried the stick to the porch where the others were shelling beans by lantern light. He held it up so the notches caught the flame. "Started this for furniture," he said. "Turns out it was for measuring something bigger." Lily looked up, being dust on her cheeks. "Like what?" "Like us," Jonah answered before Samuel could. "Like how far we've come." Samuel flipped the stick over. On the back, in letters so small you had to tilt it to the light to read, he'd burned a single line the night the first corn ear ripened. From abandoned to abundant. 18 inches at a time. He handed it to Mason. "Your turn to keep it now. Add a notch every spring. When it's full, carve a new one. Somebody'll need it someday." Mason ran his thumb over the marks. Samuel's first at 12, Lily's first at 9, Jonah's angry slash when he'd hit 5'0" and thought he'd never grow, Henry's careful line from the day he admitted the mountains had made him young again. He looked up, eyes shining. "We'll need a longer stick." Samuel grinned, the same grin that had split his face the morning the first corn sprouted. "Then we'll cut a longer ash." On quiet evenings, Samuel would hold his handmade ruler and reflect on the strange journey that had brought him to this place of competence and self-reliance. The precisely carved notches represented more than measurement increments. They were symbols of the careful attention and patient work that transformed raw potential into practical capability. The ruler lay beside Samuel's other treasured tools, a reminder that true measurement came not from comparing oneself to others, but from tracking one's own progress toward goals that mattered. In the mountains, Samuel had learned to measure what was truly important: the growth of character, skill, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing he could build whatever life he chose to create. The GPS device lay on Samuel's workbench like an artifact from another civilization, its black plastic case and digital screen foreign among the hand-carved tools and natural materials that filled his workshop. The hiking family that had visited the previous week had left it behind accidentally, and when they returned to retrieve it, they found Samuel examining the device with the same careful attention he might give to an unusual piece of wood or an unfamiliar plant. "Keep it," the father had said when Samuel offered to return the GPS unit. "A boy living alone out here should have some way to navigate if he gets lost." The man meant well, but Samuel could see in his eyes the assumption that wilderness living was inherently dangerous and unpredictable, requiring technological backup for safety. Samuel thanked the family politely, but made no promises about using the device. After they left, he spent an evening exploring its functions, marveling at the tiny screen that could display his exact location anywhere on Earth. The technology was impressive, representing decades of scientific advancement and engineering sophistication. But it also represented something that troubled Samuel in ways he was only beginning to understand. The GPS unit worked by connecting to satellites orbiting high above the Earth, part of a vast technological network that made location finding automatic and effortless. Samuel could press a few buttons and know precisely where he stood, what direction he was facing, and how to navigate to any destination programmed into its memory. The device eliminated the need for map reading, compass work, or the careful attention to natural landmarks that had guided human navigation for thousands of years. Samuel set the GPS beside his grandfather's brass compass, studying the contrast between old and new approaches to finding one's way in the world. The compass was simple, reliable, and completely independent of any external systems. It pointed north because of fundamental magnetic forces that had operated since the Earth's formation. The GPS required satellites, computer networks, and electrical power, all of which could fail or be denied. More importantly, the compass required Samuel to think and observe, to develop skills that made him more capable and self-reliant. Using the GPS would make navigation easier, but it would also make Samuel more dependent on systems he did not understand and could not repair or maintain. Over the following days, Samuel found himself thinking about the broader implications of choosing between traditional skills and modern conveniences. The mountain wilderness had taught him that capability was more valuable than comfort, that understanding processes was more important than simply accessing results. The GPS could tell him where he was, but it could not teach him to read the forest signs that revealed weather patterns animal behavior, or seasonal changes. Samuel had learned to navigate using methods that connected him directly to his environment. He read the position of the sun and stars, observed the flow of water and the growth patterns of trees, noticed how wind directions change with elevation and time of day. These skills made him more aware of his surroundings, more attuned to the subtle signals that revealed the forest's moods and rhythms. The choice between GPS and compass represented a larger question that Samuel had been wrestling with throughout his wilderness year. What did it mean to live authentically in a world increasingly dominated by technology that promised to make life easier, but might also make people less capable? Samuel had discovered that difficulty and challenge were not obstacles to be avoided, but opportunities for growth and learning. The hard work of rebuilding the cabin had developed his strength and skills. The isolation had taught him to rely on his own resources and judgment. The seasonal challenges had connected him to natural rhythms that modern life often ignored or suppressed. Using the GPS would not necessarily make Samuel's life better, just different. He would gain convenience, but lose the satisfaction that came from developing traditional skills. He would have easier access to precise location data, but less intimate knowledge of the landscape around his home. After a week of consideration, Samuel made his decision. He carefully packaged the GPS device and placed it in his supply cache, where it would be available if a genuine emergency required its use. But for daily navigation and exploration, he would continue relying on his compass, his growing knowledge of local landmarks, and the observation skills that connected him directly to the mountain environment. The choice felt right in ways that Samuel could not fully articulate. He was not rejecting technology out of stubbornness or fear, but choosing the tools and methods that serve his deeper goals of self-reliance and environmental connection. The GPS was an impressive achievement of human ingenuity, but it was not the right tool for the life Samuel was building in the mountains. On the 10th morning, he carried both instruments to the porch. Left hand, the brass compass his grandfather had carried through 2 wars and 3 decades of Montana winters. Right hand, the plastic brick that could talk to the sky. He set the GPS on the rail, screen glowing green, arrow pointing dead north. Then he opened the compass. The needle trembled, found its place, and settled a hair's breadth west of the GPS arrow. Samuel smiled the way a man smiles when he catches the mountain line. He flipped the compass lid shut, slipped it into his pocket where it belonged, and walked the GPS down to the garden gate. There he buried it under the flat rock Lily used as a stepping stone to reach the bean trellis, deep enough that no boot would ever kick it up, shallow enough that a determined kid with a stick might find it someday. He pressed the dirt smooth with his palm and whispered to the black box going dark beneath the stone. "Sleep tight, little brother. Some shortcuts aren't worth the shorter path." Standing on the ridge above his cabin with the brass compass in his hand, Samuel felt the satisfaction that came from knowing exactly where he was through his own observations and skills. The modern compass pointed north with the same reliability it had shown his grandfather, connecting Samuel to generations of navigators who had found their way through careful attention to the world around them. The welcome mat Samuel braided from dried grass and wildflower stems took shape slowly over the course of autumn evenings, each strand woven with the care and attention he had learned to bring to all his handiwork. The materials came from the meadow behind his cabin, where he had spent the summer cultivating both vegetables and the wild plants that had volunteered to share his garden space. Samuel had never considered making a welcome mat until a comment from his most recent visitors, an elderly couple who had hiked up from the valley to see the legendary cabin built by a child. The woman had paused at his threshold and remarked, "Every proper home needs a welcome mat. It's the first thing that tells visitors they're approaching a place where hospitality matters." The observation struck Samuel as profound. Over the past year and a half, his focus had been entirely on survival, construction, and self-sufficiency. He had created a structure that could shelter him through mountain winters and provide everything he needed for independent living. But he had not consciously thought about creating a home in the deeper sense, a place that offered warmth and welcome to others. The braiding technique Samuel used for the mat was one he had developed through experimentation, combining